What happens when your neighbor calls the cops over your Mustang? And I'm the very police chief she's trying to summon. What if the badge I carry is the mirror that shatters her illusion and forces me to face my own truth? You ask me where the story begins, and I say it begins with sound, the low animal of a 1969 Mustang exhaling into a cul-de-sac that pretends its pulses sleep, the kind of sound that makes the night remember it has a spine. On screen, the word illusion hovers over tidy hedges and HOA-approved mailboxes, while truth flickers at the chrome lip of a tailpipe that remembers every long mile of its freedom and refuses to apologize for its age. I tell you directly, I drive this car not to be loud but to stay awake, because leadership dulls the edges, and a machine with teeth keeps me honest when titles and ceremony would prefer I drift. Aristotle said character is habit made visible, and the Mustang is one of my habits. A metronome with pistons, an old red thesis I rehearse against the tyranny of appearances and the seduction of power that wants to be adored rather than obeyed. Karen, 2 doors down, curates appearances like a gallery, and her mornings are a choreography of sprinklers, yoga, and quiet that she treats like a deed filed at the county and notarized by routine. I respect quiet. I also respect the right of an engine to clear its throat after a day of putting out other people's fires, literal and metaphorical, and that sounds indulgent to you. Wait for the ledger of context to open its heavy covers. The first call is not a call at all, but a look, a glance cast over a hydrangea hedge with the moral voltage of sermon, and I absorb it the way a conductor absorbs weather before the first note. You think I'm defensive, but I'm reflective because I have learned that power only seems clean when it is pretending not to be negotiating with human frailty in the shadows. On screen, cut to my hand on the shifter, wedding band catching the last amber sunset, then a slow pan to the speedometer resting easy at a suburban 30. The needle is calm as a sleeping dog. The HOA email earlier was prim, a digital doily, a reminder about vehicle noise after 9 p.m., unspecific but aimed, as arrows often are, at whoever is unashamed of joy that doesn't file its edges down. I tell you the truth. Discipline is not the same as denial, and I have never confused compliance with virtue, though many homeowners do and call the confusion maturity. Karen's porch light blinks twice, a private semaphore displeasure, and I pretend not to read it because adults should not live by blinks, yet we do, and we call it neighborly nuance. Nietzsche wanders through my head whispering about masks, and I wonder which one I'm wearing tonight. Neighbor, man, custodian of order, animal with keys, and whether any of them are honest enough to stand public light. I idle in the driveway just long enough to let the oil settle into its little cathedral, and in that small purr I hear every civics lesson I've ever given about restraint, proportion, and the courtesy of limits. My phone vibrates against the console, and the screen blooms with a number I know too well. The front desk that converts complaint into incident with keystroke, a code, and an entry that outlives temper. On screen, truth in sharp white. Noise complaint on Willow Court, possible ordinance violation, vehicle described as classic red Mustang. Repeat concern from caller. A caption like a summons. Can you feel the hinge creak? The way a private habit turns public under the soft booter procedure, and how even fairness becomes theatrical when the stage is your own driveway and the audience is your street. I breathe, then I answer, because I always answer, and the clerk's voice is polite as a winter uniform. Chief, we got a call from your block. How would you like us to proceed? Do you hear the irony, or do you hear the trap? Because there are 2 kinds of corruption, what you take and what you allow yourself to avoid, and I vow to practice neither while the badge sit heavy. Karen steps onto her porch with a phone to her ear and conviction that the universe will align around the sound of it, and I can't fault her. Most universes do when they think they're paying the HOA on time. On screen, illusion overlays her silhouette with the words, just following the rules, while truth scrolls beneath. Power is a mirror you carry whether you admit it or not, and the reflection does not forgive laziness. I cut the engine, because theater matters when peace is a choreography, and I stand in the pooled light of the garage like a defendant in a play I wrote without meaning to rehearse. You want to laugh this off, to wink, to flex authority like a gym muscle, but authority is not biceps, it is a ledger, and every choice writes a line you cannot erase even if your title begs you to try. I walk to the curb, and the night air tastes like grass and a hint of gasoline and the faint copper nerves, and I say, "Evening, Karen," Because civility is a tool, not a surrender, and tools are what keep us from fists. She says, some of us have children sleeping, and the sentence arrives like a verdict you are not allowed to appeal, and I receive it without flinching because I know the weight of sleeping children and the cost of waking them. Foucault would smirk at our choreography. Two bodies marking territory with diction and posture, and I refuse to be the caricature of the badge she imagines dialing into a scene like a deity. I tell her the car is within legal limits and that I'm mindful of the hour, and she tells me legal limits are not the same as respect, and she is not wrong, and she is not entirely right, and that tension is the neighborhood. On screen, the word boundary pulses between us like a heartbeat, and the camera drifts to blue recycle bin that will be, by morning, a pulpit for the neighborhood's sermonizing memory. Across the street a curtain stirs, which is how democracy votes at 9:07 p.m., and I imagine the comments thread already sprouting like mushrooms in damp soil under the porch of consensus. I ask you, directly, when does a neighbor become a petitioner to the state? And when does a public servant become a neighbor again? And how do we keep those lines from becoming a noose that strangles both? The clerk is still on the line, listening to our silence, and I tell her to log the calls received and to hold units unless an escalation occurs. And my voice is both firm and careful, because policy has ears. Is that favoritism? Or is that triage? And can you tell the difference when the patient is your own street and the diagnosis is a bruised nerve pretending to be a broken bone? Karen hears enough of my end to realize who I am tonight in her story. And the knowledge flashes across her face like heat lightning, dangerous only if it finds a tree with dry bark. What changes when you learn the protagonist wears a badge under his t-shirt? And what remains the same when the badge is only a different kind of neighborliness weighted by law and haunted by precedent? I do not posture. I do not apologize. I simply inhabit the awkward truth that the person she's called on is a person who answers, and I let that truth breathe between us like steam rising from fresh asphalt. On screen, illusion softens to a slow dissolve of porch lights. Then truth snaps back with a close-up of my keys. A brass star I do not flash because symbols can wound even when they intend to soothe. She says she'll call again if it continues, and I tell her to do what she thinks is right. And I mean it, because citizenship is a muscle that atrophies when you outsource it to fear or to me. The engine ticks as it cools, and each tick is a syllable in a language older than bylaws, older than code, older than polite contempt. And the night leans closer to hear which grammar will rule the next minute. You want a hero or a villain or at least a meme, but what you get is a man standing beside a sleeping machine asking himself which version of order he can live with tomorrow when the cameras are gone. And so the first key point is this. The story does not start with a conflict between a car and complaint. It starts with a collision between illusion and truth at the curb where we decide whether power will be a cudgel or a covenant and whether our names can survive the choice. I woke the next morning to the echo of my own decision ringing in the pipes. The kind of mundane symphony that pretends a night did not teach you anything about the delicate geometry of power. Before coffee, I drafted an email to my watch commander, a simple declaration that any complaint originating on my block would bypass me and be handled by an external unit. Because a badge should not be a mirror I tilt to flatter myself. On screen, the word truth fades and over a screenshot of that email, while illusion ghostwrites a version where I shrug and say perks of rank, and I refuse that draft. You want to know whether restraint is virtue or theater, and I will tell you it is both until repetition turns it into muscle memory. Karen had already posted a neat square of my car on her feed with a caption, "Some people think rules are optional," which is an elegant way of accusing a man without naming him. I did not reply there, because procedural justice begins with showing up in the right forum, not on a stage rendered by algorithms. Instead, I walked the 60 feet to her porch with the same deliberate pace I use when entering a room where my title arrives 5 seconds before I do. She opened the door like a person braced for a storm she ordered from a catalog labeled accountability, and I took off my sunglasses because eyes are part of the negotiation. I said, "Let's test the noise together, decibel meter, same spot, same hour, and if it's over, I'll cite myself and fix the exhaust, and if it's under, we'll write a neighbor plan that respects sleep and steel." She blinked, because the script she expected did not include self-citation, and scripts rebel when you refuse to play your assigned villain. On screen, a lower third appears, boundaries, then a cut to the sidewalk chalk line where we agree to place the tripod like a miniature court of appeals. Do you believe in Kant's old rule, Act only on that maxim you could will to be universal. Because I do when it hurts me, or it isn't a rule, it's a costume. The test that night was boring the way honesty often is. Idle at 67 decibels. Rev at 78. Short blip at 82. Then a sharp look from me at myself as if to say grow up, and the meter returned its indifferent numbers. The ordinance allowed 80 at the curb before 10, 70 after, and math stared at my pride with a bureaucrat smile. I wrote the citation into the system of my own ID and routed the fine to my account. Not because pain purifies, but because fair is a language you have to conjugate aloud if you want the neighborhood to believe you still speak it. Karen watched, and for a second the heat in her shoulders lowered by a single meaningful degree, which is often a measurable victory available to adults. Then came the second call, dressed up as a first. Her voice on a non-emergency line reporting reckless exhibition, a phrase that wants sirens even when the facts only want a conversation. My clerk asked if we should send units, and I said send them, just not mine, and put me out of the chain, because legitimacy is precious and fragile like a glass you only own, because someone else lent it to you. 2 officers I trust arrived with body cams warm and notebooks open, and they did what they do for strangers. They measured, they asked, they documented. They resisted the hospitality of names. The report read what the numbers had already confessed, and the warning they issued to the street. Not to me, not to her, but to the ecosystem, felt like a small, secular sermon. On screen, illusion overlays a sped-up montage of porch whispers and group chats. Then truth interrupts with a freeze frame on the line item. Self-initiated citation by chief, verified by independent unit. Still, discomfort grew like ivy, because we are animals who distrust any arrangement that places one of us above the rest, even when that animal offers its own neck to the rules. I could feel the story recruiting roles, tyrant, vigilante, martyr, hypocrite. And I knew that if I didn't design a different stage, we would all be trapped performing for an audience that only applauds escalation. So I proposed a block covenant at the community center, not the HOA's lace and scold, but a document with teeth and forgiveness, an agreement to treat noise, speed, and spectacle as shared risks rather than private pleasures. Karen arrived with a folder full of articles about policing overreach, and I arrived with a stack of studies on procedural justice and a humility I had to keep reapplying like sunscreen. We argued like people who've read too much and lived enough to know reading isn't living, and the room shifted between sympathy and suspicion, as if it were on a gimbal. Rawls stood in the corner of my mind with his veil of ignorance, and I asked myself what rule I would write if I didn't know whether I'd be the Mustang or the Nap. The answer was boring again, which means it was probably right. Time windows with measurements, not moods. A contact tree that routes complaints neighbor to neighbor before badge to badge. A standing invitation to a quarterly sound test where the metric is not humiliation, but calibration. On screen, the word practice floats over a whiteboard where we sketch thresholds in dull marker, while illusion sulks in the back row hoping for a scene that makes better television. Karen said you could just turn it off without the theater, and I said I did turn it off, and I also turn on a process that outlives us, because theater is only dangerous when it replaces rules rather than introducing them. She looked at me the way citizens look at institutions they neither trust nor can live without, and I absorbed the gaze because this is the price of uniforms in democracies. A neighbor I barely know stood up and said, I don't like cops, but I like sleep, and I don't like Mustangs, but I like fairness, and the room laughed because ambivalence is the sincerest form of participation. We voted with hands, which is the oldest technology we have for turning disagreement into a plan, and the tally was not unanimous and therefore honest. Afterward, in the parking lot where sodium lights make everyone look equally mortal, Karen asked the badge ever feels like a costume I can't get off, and I told her yes, especially when I'm mowing the lawn or apologizing for an engine that reminds me I'm still a person. She said she doesn't hate the car. She hates what it represents when men drive like their stories are louder than other people's evenings. And I said that is fair, and I will drive like I share the soundtrack. On screen, truth appears over a close-up of me removing the loudest insert from the exhaust, a small, unglamorous act, while illusion collapses into a meme that will never trend because repair doesn't. I went home and wrote the policy that formalized my recusal on my block, and I signed it, and I sent it, and I pinned it to my station board where my lieutenants can hold me to it when I am tired and tempted. That night, I idled in silently, almost sheepish, and the quiet felt less like defeat and more like belonging, which is a currency official power can never print on its own. I lay awake wondering whether fairness must always taste like compromise, and whether leadership is anything more than a willingness to be seen losing loudly so others can sleep. The second key point, then, is the double bind made useful. To be both neighbor and chief without letting either costume absolve the other, to accept the discomfort as tuition, and to design a world where even my engine knows the difference between illusion and truth. The third movement began not with an engine, but with an email copied to too many people to be private. On screen, the word illusion hovers over the subject line. Selective enforcement on Willow Court, while truth pulses beneath the CC field that reads like a jury pool I did not pick. Carrot filed a formal complaint with the city manager alleging that my recusal was itself an exertion of influence, a paradox so elegant it almost made me admire its geometry. Do you see how quickly fairness can be weaponized by suspicion, and how suspicion grows best in the shade cast by uniforms? I read the document twice, then a third time, because the first reading is for pride, the second for fear, and the third for policy. She wrote that my presence had chilled her rights to seek relief, and that the neighborhood covenant we drafted was an instrument of soft coercion. And I tasted metal because language is a blade when sharpened by grievance. I did not call her dramatic. I called internal affairs. On screen, truth appears over a simple sentence I sent. Please open review, full access, no redactions, while illusion shows a phantom version where I ask for a quiet fix and a friendly wink. The investigators arrive with the practiced boredom of people who know that legitimacy is built out of dull bricks, and they interview me in a room that smells like coffee and the sediment of other people's mistakes. I told them the facts, the timestamps, the decibel readings, the self-citation, the recusal memo, and I asked for a public summary because secrecy is gasoline to rumor. Meanwhile, the neighborhood performed its ancient play in modern costumes, which is to say a town hall in the comment section. On screen, a carousel. Screenshots, cropped videos, a sped-up montage of my car idling stitched to a clip of a siren from another night. Illusion doing what illusion does when it edits out the dates. Miguel texted me, breathe, show up in person, let them see the boring receipts, and I held that advice like a talisman. The council scheduled a public comment session, a secular confessional where microphones turn breath into transcript, and I put my name on the list like any other citizen who must wear his choices in daylight. I walked into chambers without the uniform, because the cloth adds volume even when you whisper. I wanted my sentences to carry their own weight. Baldwin rode shotgun in my head saying that innocence is a moral deformity, and I refused to be innocent of optics any longer. Karen spoke first, crisp and composed, arguing that proximity to power is power, and that no covenant crafted in the shadow of a badge can ever be fully free. She was not wrong about the shadow, and admitting that felt like opening a window in a room where I had grown too comfortable with my own air. I said, into the mic and into the record, that in liberal orders the cure for proximity is transparency, that I had relinquished decisions on my block, that I had paid the price my meter demanded, and that I would accept any reasonable limit the community imposed on me as a driver and a neighbor. On screen, the word truth locks on the phrase relinquish decisions, while illusion tries to hold a frame on police chief, as if titles were destiny rather than jobs. A man from 3 Streets overshouted that Mustangs are cop toys, and a woman from our block said her toddler finally sleeps, and my heart ricocheted between caricature and gratitude. The council president asked the liaison to summarize the IA review, and the dullest words in government became the most important. Policy complied, process followed, self-citation verified, recusal executed, no evidence of preferential treatment found. Do you think that settled it, or do you know better? Because narratives do not end when facts arrive. They molt. After the meeting, a young activist approached me with eyes like litmus paper and asked if I understood why my mere existence as chief in that cul-de-sac feels like a surveillance tower. And I said yes, and I also asked her whether she sees the tower I live in when every misstep becomes emblematic of a class rather than a man. She said both towers are real, and we stood in the hallway like 2 surveyors who finally agree a cliff is a cliff even if their maps disagree about the color. On screen, illusion fades over the lobby's glossy tile. Then truth lands on the word coexistence. Not as a romance, but as a truce requiring maintenance. The next day brought a different escalation. A street racing clip circulated citywide. And though the car was not mine, the rumor barnacled itself to my plates because myth is sticky like that. I spent the afternoon with a traffic unit under an overpass where rubber writes hieroglyphs, drafting a targeted operation to pull noise and recklessness apart from nostalgia and care, and I knew some would call it hypocrisy, and some would call it leadership. Simone Weil whispered that attention is the purest form of generosity, so I gave attention to corners where harm is born and left my pride unattended at home. We set up a Saturday clinic for enthusiasts. Free inspections, sound meters, legal advice, track day vouchers, a civic judo that tries to redirect force rather than simply oppose it. Karen showed up, arms folded, then slowly unfolded as a teenage girl explained how the car she built with her mother is the only thing that makes algebra make sense, and I watched the story crack along a kinder seam. On screen, the word practice overlays a montage of wrenches, clipboards, nods, and a trash can full of legal cutouts surrender without drama. Illusion sulks in the corner asking where the handcuffs went. That night, when I brought the Mustang home with its new baffles installed, the engine sounded like a memory that had learned inside voice, and the cul-de-sac exhaled. Karen and I met at the curb again, but this time we spoke like co-authors editing the same paragraph instead of plaintiffs drafting separate complaints. She admitted the complaint to counsel was a way to test whether my fairness was procedural or merely performative, and I admitted the IA request was my way to keep my worst self from borrowing the badge. We stood there a long minute, letting the silence be not a verdict but a shared resource, and I felt, for the first time, that the story might yet refuse the cheap ending. On screen, truth appears over the older woman's window, dark at a decent hour, while illusion dissolves into a reel that never quite trends because nothing dramatic happened, and that is the point. Still, I won't flatter us with a moral, because power does not forgive complacency, and the next test is always idling somewhere with a full tank. So the third key point resolves not into applause but into a draft of discipline. Transparency as habit, recusal as muscle, covenant as tool, enforcement as last resort, and the humility to be bored by your own virtue so others can sleep. Tell me, with the lights up and the cameras cooling, shall we proceed to key point 4, where the world decides whether our little experiment survives its first real stress test? The night chose a different instrument to test us, not an engine but a transformer that blew with a gunshot pop, drenching our block in a blackout that made every window a small, apprehensive eye. On screen, illusion floats over a wash of perfect suburban dusk from a realtor's brochure. Then truth cuts to a street swallowed by dark, the only light a ragged crescent, and the jitter of phone screens try and be suns. The first lesson of power outages is primitive. Sound becomes sight, and the ear inherits authority. So when a caravan of unfamiliar engines drifted down our court, 2 Chargers, a cambered Civic, a bike with a wasp sting idle, you could feel the neighborhood gather itself like a muscle. I did not start the Mustang. I refused to give the night an easy scapegoat, and instead I rolled her quietly down the drive by hand with Karen on the bumper, our palms squeaking in the dark like a secret treaty rediscovered. On screen, the word boundary pulses in pale white as the car's silhouette settles across the mouth of the cul-de-sac, like a sleeping animal we agree not to wake. The contact chain we'd written in the covenant lit up, not with outrage but with function. Miguel pinged the older woman's son, because we knew her oxygen concentrator would fail within the hour, and I called the city's medical liaison to request a portable battery, speaking not as chief but as neighbor whose voice just happens to be in the right directory. If you want to know the difference between theater and procedure, watch how quickly boredom becomes beautiful when the right checklist arrives. Karen's texted me with 6 words, people circling cars, not from here, and even stripped of punctuation, it carried a history of nights that ended poorly in other zip codes. I walked into the street without my badge, which is to say I walked with a heavier badge of being known here, and I asked the newcomers if they were lost, because questions are softer than orders, but they still move bodies. The driver of the lead Charger thumbed the brim of a cap that read in "Oh gods" and "Oh masters" and "Oh mufflers," and he laughed politely with that pre-fight courtesy men inherit, like a bad heirloom. He said they were just kicking it until the grid chilled out. On screen, illusion overlays a quick-cut reel of harmless fun, while truth freezes a frame on a floor jack, sliding out a trunk slick with oil. 2 silhouettes peeled off toward Karen's SUV, and I knew enough about catalytic converter theft to recognize the scene staging itself with cordless saws and practiced silence, and I heard in my head the dull thunk of old cases, unsolved and unsurprising. I did not make a speech about law. I made a call that we had promised to make when non-residents with tools met our list of thresholds, and I told dispatch I was recused from command and would be available as witness, not as shepherd. If that sounds like bureaucracy to you, ask yourself what discipline looks like when your impulse wants to dress itself as necessity. The bike's idle skittered into a scalpel-sharp rev that tried to carve its initials into our dark, and a toddler cried 2 houses down, which is a siren more honest than ours. Miguel arrived with a portable generator, like a priest carrying a reliquary, and the older woman's house hummed back to life with the faintest green blink in her window, a small consecration to the dull persistence of care. The jack under Karen's SUV lifted an inch as if testing the street spine, and I stepped forward with palms visible, speaking to hands instead of the faces, telling them we had battery backup cameras recording, and that the fastest exit from a night was the way they came. And sometimes narration is a form of mercy that lets pride save face. They froze the way animals do when the ecosystem changes. Quiet first, then tense, then calculating. And across the dark, I heard Karen's voice land like a punctuation mark, clear, firm, precise. Leave the tools and go, we won't chase. On screen, truth pulses over silhouette, while illusion tries to pull a shot toward my shadow, hungry for the old trope of the chief who saves what he already owns. A cruiser rolled into block with lights off, slow and heavy as a sermon, and the thieves abandoned the jack handle with a clatter that sounded like a verdict I didn't have to deliver. You might be waiting for tackles, cuffs, spectacle, but some nights justice is the embarrassed shuffle of shoes retreating to a car that will never be as fast as consequence. The bike and the Civic peeled away like startled fish, and the Chargers idled in place, their drivers watching us with a blank expression of people deciding whether the night owes them a story. I remembered the clinic we'd run under the overpass, the way a track voucher eats bravado like sugar, and I said, quietly enough to be heard and not recorded as a flex, that if they wanted legal noise and attention, there was a lit lot on Saturday where applause didn't come with charges. Is that corny? Or is that civic Aikido? And can you forgive corny if it turns temperature down by a crucial single degree? They smirked, which is one notch cooler than scoffing, and they drifted out, leaving behind a jack, a saw, and a small constellation of dropped hardware we would later collect in a coffee can like strange hail. The second wave of stress was quieter and meaner, a rumor in the dark that I had staged a blackout, to stage a rescue, to stage a PR win. And if you think that's absurd, you have not met the inventive stamina of resentment. On screen, illusion flashes a carousel of chat screenshots and crop videos where my hands pushing the Mustang look like choreography, while truth hold on a timestamp utility alert from the city about the blown transformer and the zip codes it swallowed. I could have ignored the whispers as oxygen burned by a fire that had no fuel, but I know from my job that narratives eat silence, so I did the boring thing and posted a notice with links, diagrams, and the sentence. I did not request cause or benefit from a loss of power. I benefited from you. If the last clause sounds sentimental, don't mistake it for apology. It is an accounting of the value of neighbors who show up when your generator is louder than your pride. Inside the blackout, once the thieves left and the cruisers idle like calm beasts at the edge of the block, there was still the matter of the street racers who might return with reinforcements because empty streets and dead signals are catnip for the cult of spectacle. We enacted the covenant like we'd rehearsed. Cars staggered along the curb in a way that preserved egress for ambulances but made donuts geometrically tedious. Porch shares occupied by pairs instead of lone sentries. Phone cameras visible without becoming invitations to perform. Karen moved like a conductor between porches. Not bossy, not meek. Explained to a pair of teenagers why the adrenaline they were chasing could be rented legally for $20 and a waiver, and I watched them blush at the price of adult attention. If you need a philosopher here, take Epictetus, who would remind you that the chief task is to distinguish what is in our control from what is not, and on a dark street what we control was posture, light, and the tone of our sentences. The second cruise arrived, and a third, slow, unhurried, not arrayed but frame, and I stood back by the mailbox like a civilian who knows the choreography and refuses to improvise a solo. The officer in charge waved me over, and I stopped at the agreed radius, and he briefed me as if I were any neighbor who reads, listens, nods, and does not substitute opinion for orders, and that small discipline felt more radical than any speech I could have given. On screen, truth lands on a phrase no special treatment, while illusion dissolves into a meme that wanted me at the center even when the safest place for me was the edge. The blackout lasted 97 minutes by the city's clock, but it felt like a seminar taught by weather and boredom. And you should know that boredom is the sexiest thing we have when danger wants a flirt. When the transformer returned to its low iron and the houses glowed back one by one, you could hear our collective nervous system stepping down from DEFCON curiosity to civilian peace known as dishes in the sink and teeth brushed in dim bathrooms. We took inventory. The oxygen patient steady, the jack surrendered, the rumor countered, the racers redirected, the saw in evidence, the Covenant used without screaming, and the Mustang still asleep across the street mouth like a bridge between impulse and plan. Karen stood beside me in the returning light like a co-signer on a loan we are still repaying, and she said, almost to herself, I used to think the noise was a problem. And I said, sometimes the noise is the warning that brings us outside. Do you hear the hinge in that exchange? The way a story redraws itself when its favorite villain gets a different job? We pushed the Mustang back into the driveway together while the block coiled its hoses and collected its lawn chairs and resumed its ordinary, which is the most underrated hero in any city that intends to wake up tomorrow. The officers took statements like librarians checking books back in after a storm, polite, precise, uninterested in drama, once the plot had softened, and I signed mine with the dull satisfaction of a man who did not get to be epic and will sleep better for it. If you want blood in your fiction, you will be disappointed. But if you want proof of concept, you can have it. A covenant with thresholds, a chief who stayed a neighbor who borrowed courage from the badge without borrowing the badge, a street that refused to audition for virality. On screen, illusion fades to a final quick cut of last week's comment thread fizzling out under the weight of nothing happening, while truth lingers on the generator's hum smoothing into silence like a metronome clicking to zero at the end of a long piece. I ended the night with a broom in one hand and the return jack in the other, and I set them both down like tools I intend to keep within reach because the next test will arrive at the hour we'd least prefer, with a sound we don't like, asking us what we owe each other when the grid in our heads flickers. The stress test did not crown a hero or bury a villain. It measured whether our discipline could outrun our instincts, and for 97 minutes on a dark street, we outran them. Not with glory, but with posture. If that feels anticlimactic, you have misunderstood climax. In civic life, the crescendo is a refusal to let escalation write your epilogue, and the applause is a neighborhood go to bed at a decent hour with its tools accounted for and its illusions traded for usable truths. The week after the blackout, the city didn't send a storm. It sent a mirror, and I learned that the most volatile thing I own is not the Mustang's exhaust, but the narrative that clings to it like heat after the engine shuts down. On screen, illusion flickers across a glossy magazine mock-up. Chief with the classic, the man humanizing law enforcement, while truth cuts to the email from the mayor's aide. Decline profile, optics complex, union sensitive, activist alert. Do you hear how a compliment can be a trap, and how the trap is sprung by the part of you that wants to be loved for being good at being fair? My spouse, who believes in both my job and my capacity for self-deception, asked me at breakfast whether the car is a relic or a ritual, and I could not answer without consulting a ghost. So after shift I drove quietly to the garage that smells like old rubber and citrus cleaner and a particular era of my father's voice, and I asked the mechanic who taught me torque. His hands cracked like dry riverbeds. If a machine can be a mask. He wiped the socket with the kind of concentration that passes for prayer in rooms like this. And he said, a mask is what you wear to be seen. A ritual is what you do to stay honest. And the only way to tell the difference is to count the harm it causes when you're done. On screen, truth lands on his sentence, while illusion tries to zoom in on my badge, sitting on the workbench like a starfish out of water. I pulled up a noise map of our city, those jagged heat blooms over freeways and club rows and the unlucky blocks where history decided to nap, and I saw what I had not let myself see clearly. Enforcement clusters where patience is cheap and political capital expensive, light touch where lawyers brunch by the gallon and misery is politely zoned. Do you understand particular shame of discovering that the system you pastor sings louder in neighborhoods that cannot afford to change the station? I called the data team and asked for a 5-year breakdown of stops labeled noise and exhibition, and the numbers returned with the bureaucratic calm of a judge who has given the sentence 100 times. More tickets where wages are hourly, fewer warnings where lawn care contracts are annual, and yes, a correlation with race that would make a saint swear. I stared at the screen until the pixels stopped being dots and started being faces, and I asked myself whether my covenant on Willow Court was a boutique morality or a prototype. I told myself that the only honest answer would cost me comfort. On screen, illusion overlays a press release draft touting community partnership, while truth freezes on a policy memo I began. Equity and noise, from penance to procedure. I wrote, then rewrote, then softened and sharpened, a section restricting pretext stops for equipment noise unless there's a safety nexus. I shifted over time from saturation patrols to diversion clinics. I authorized track night vouchers. Yes, the corny Aikido scaled up, funded not by grants with glossy photos, but by reallocating the same dollars we burned writing citations that turn into resentments unpaid. The union president called my cell with the irritated civility of a man whose world is built on the grammar of no surprises. And he said the changes would handcuff officers while letting scofflaw skate, and I heard in his voice a stew of sincere caution and institutional inertia. I said, calm and unperformative, that handcuffs exist for risks, not for imagination, and that we are not defunding attention. We are redeploying toward the places where harm is likely rather than where anger is fashionable. On screen, truth appears over a pie chart of collisions prevented versus tickets, written in the pilot zones, while illusion tries to linger on a smear of rubber in a cul-de-sac as if evidence were a mood. Karen texted me a screenshot of a neighborhood forum thread in a part of town that doesn't know my street by name. The thread accused me of going soft, of chiefing by TED Talk, and one comment crafted a parable where my car was the original sin and my reforms the fig leaf. Tell me, when the story you live becomes a costume others hang on you, do you burn the closet or change the script? I didn't either. I went to a listening session at a rec center where the AC sighs like an old choir, and I sat in a circle of folding chairs while a grandmother asked me why we hear tickets faster than we hear lullabies. I told her the truth in the plainest grammar I own. Because tickets print easier than trust, and because trust is a line item that never fits in a budget year. Miguel spoke next, describing our blackout not as a war story, but as a recipe. Names, thresholds, battery backups, visible phones, the sound of the jack surrendered. And he said the line that rescued my policy from abstraction. We didn't need fewer rules. We needed rules that remembered our names. On screen, a lower third reads names, while illusion dissolves into a montage of sirens that never arrive where the speech ends. Then the city sent a test within the test. A viral takeover. 2 districts overspilled into an impromptu parade down a corridor where storefronts live paycheck to paycheck. And a kid barely older than my exhaustion fell off the roof of a moving car and broke a bone that will remember the night every time a rain gets political. The old playbook would have ordered a grid of cruisers and net citations. The new one I had written on an anxious Tuesday ordered cones, drones for overhead evidence, a bullhorn team composed of both officers and community mediators, corridors to bleed the crowd into legal lots, and a single arrest threshold. Fights, firearms, or fire. Was it messy? Yes. Was it perfect? No. Did it keep bone from becoming funeral? Yes. And I will carry that modest calculus like a coin in my pocket for the mornings when an editorial calls me naive. Officers grumbled. Some meant it. A few auditioned for grievances camera. Most adjusted because adults do when the results are boringly good. On screen, truth freezes on a chart. Injuries down, pursuits down, citations converted to warnings plus clinic sign-ups up. Illusion tries to animate a clip of a burnout as if spectacle were a statistic. Later that week, a local podcast invited me to debate a pundit who thrives on volume. I declined with a sentence that annoyed his sponsors. I'm too busy installing quiet to perform loud. Karen heard it and left a note on my porch. Just a folded paper with 2 words, good stubborn, which might be the only epitaph I could accept without protest. But the temptation you asked about, the edge of authority that tastes like adrenaline dressed as virtue, it found me anyway in the most intimate theater. At my curb, alone after midnight, with the Mustangs at open and the nocturne of a city settling into its insomnia. I felt the old thrum of my wrists. Start it, let it breathe. Remind yourself you are not only your caution, and I asked out loud a question with more teeth than I expected. Do I want quiet because it is good, or because it protects my image of myself as a chief who outgrew boy without killing it? On screen, illusion tries to center the car like an altar. Truth cuts to my phone screen where the covenant lives as a pin note. After 10 p.m., engine on only for necessity. Necessary means safety, not nostalgia. I close the hood. I walk the block instead, the way a penitent counts beads, and I rehearse the sentences I now say like liturgy when I brief new recruits. Power must not love itself. Authority must prefer boredom to glory. Policy must survive your moods. The next morning, Internal Affairs sent follow-up. Not about me this time, but about a squad whose noise enforcement had wandered into contempt in a neighborhood that cannot afford contempt, and I signed a discipline that hurt because they are mine and because they knew better. If you want to know whether reform is real, check for the receipts that cost you friends. The union filed predictable grievance. The mayor's office sent a cautious thank you. An activist I respect posted, "We'll see," which is the only honest verdict I trust in a city still learning not to improvise itself into emergency. Karen and I co-host of All Surreal Things, a Saturday sound school at the Community College Auto Bay. Decibel meters, muffler anatomy, a hidden history talk on the way noise ordinances have been used as proxy wars against the poor and the young, then a Q&A where a teenager asked me if adulthood is just apology with a mortgage. I told him no, adulthood is maintenance with conscience, and sometimes apology is a solvent that frees a stuck bolt. On screen, truth holds on a pair of hands, one with grease on the nails, one with a wedding ring, turning the same wrench, while illusion pouts in the corner because content without conflict is allegedly unmonetizable. At home that night, my spouse poured tea like an acquittal and asked whether I was keeping the car. I said yes, and I meant it without defensiveness for the first time, because I had finally priced it. Tune tax, thresholds, humility, a steady habit of being seen choosing sleep over swagger, and a willingness to sell the day it becomes a mask. Do you see the shape of the fifth arc now? The old symbol examined until it either earns its keep or gets retired. The job updated until it can love dull victories. The neighbor and the chief refusing to let either costume handcuff the other? On screen, a final cue for this movement. Illusion fades under the caption spectacle, while truth rises under the caption practice. I cannot promise you that the city will keep believing in the quiet we're building, but I can promise you the covenant is no longer boutique. It is a draft being copied into precinct briefings, clinic signups, HOA newsletters, and the private thresholds inside the heads of people who prefer sleep to applause and still want their engines to mean something other than trouble. If you can tolerate an unsettling confession as we approach the end, I like who I am more when boredom wins, and I fear the part of me that misses a drama. So I will keep the ledger visible, the rules legible, the car tamed, the badge distrusted by the man who wears it, and the neighborhood tuned to a frequency where illusion makes good television and truth makes better mornings. On screen, illusion tries to center the car like an altar. Truth cuts to my phone screen where the covenant lives as a pinned note. After 10 p.m., engine on only for necessity. Necessary means safety, not nostalgia. I close the hood. I walk the block instead, the way a penitent counts beads, and I rehearse the sentences I now say like liturgy when I brief new recruits. Power must not love itself. Authority must prefer boredom to glory. Policy must survive your moods. The next morning, Internal Affairs sent follow-up. Not about me this time, but about a squad whose noise enforcement had wandered into contempt in a neighborhood that cannot afford contempt, and I signed a discipline that hurt because they are mine and because they knew better. If you want to know whether reform is real, check for the receipts that cost you friends. The union filed predictable grievance. The mayor's office sent a cautious thank you. An activist I respect posted, "We'll see," which is the only honest verdict I trust in a city still learning not to improvise itself into emergency. Karen and I co-host of All Surreal Things, a Saturday sound school at the Community College Auto Bay. Decibel meters, muffler anatomy, a hidden history talk on the way noise ordinances have been used as proxy wars against the poor and the young, then a Q&A where a teenager asked me if adulthood is just apology with a mortgage. I told him no, adulthood is maintenance with conscience, and sometimes apology is a solvent that frees a stuck bolt. On screen, truth holds on a pair of hands, one with grease on the nails, one with a wedding ring, turning the same wrench, while illusion pouts in the corner because content without conflict is allegedly unmonetizable. At home that night, my spouse poured tea like an acquittal and asked whether I was keeping the car. I said yes, and I meant it without defensiveness for the first time, because I had finally priced it. Tune tax, thresholds, humility, a steady habit of being seen choosing sleep over swagger, and a willingness to sell the day it becomes a mask. Do you see the shape of the fifth arc now? The old symbol examined until it either earns its keep or gets retired. The job updated until it can love dull victories. The neighbor and the chief refusing to let either costume handcuff the other? On screen, a final cue for this movement. Illusion fades under the caption spectacle, while truth rises under the caption practice. I cannot promise you that the city will keep believing in the quiet we're building, but I can promise you the Covenant is no longer boutique. It is a draft being copied into precinct briefings, clinic signups, HOA newsletters, and the private thresholds inside the heads of people who prefer sleep to applause and still want their engines to mean something other than trouble. If you can tolerate an unsettling confession as we approach the end, I like who I am more when boredom wins, and I fear the part of me that misses a drama. So I will keep the ledger visible, the rules legible, the car tamed, the badge distrusted by the man who wears it, and the neighborhood tuned to a frequency where illusion makes good television and truth makes better mornings. And she said, with the dry wit of a person who is paid in stress and receipts, we are inconveniently hopeful, which is perhaps the only posture that refuses both cynicism and denial. On screen, illusion makes one last attempt to assemble a villain from low-angle shots and out-of-context decibel spikes, but truth lays a simple montage across it. Porch lights at reasonable hours, the older woman's window dark in peace, a clinic calendar with full slots, a policy memo with track changes turned to accepted, a well-worn broom leaning by a garage, a map of stops bending toward equity, a car show where noise is measured, not performed, a neighborhood text thread that mostly discusses lost cats and yard sales, and the word enough, not shouted, not weaponized, simply spoken when needed and believed because we practice believing it. The harsh truth, as promised, is that you don't get to be innocent here, not as a neighbor, not as a chief, not as a critic, not as a kid with a socket wrench in a dream. You get to be useful, and usefulness is dull 90% of the time and glorious in ways you cannot sell to sponsor. A 97-minute blackout without a fight, a paraded weekend without an ER, a comment thread that dies of malnutrition, a classic car that purrs inside a Covenant, a badge that distrusts its own appetite, in time to choose policy over pose. I will not promise a happily ever after. I will promise a docket of thresholds reviewed quarterly, a public sheet of citations and warnings by zip code, clinics on Saturdays that will bore you if you came for spectacle, and a Covenant that remembers names before it remembers protocols. And if that offends your love of drama, you may need to ask whether drama is the last mask your illusions where when truth has become uncomfortably practical. So here's my call to action, and I am addressing you directly because you live on a block somewhere even if you swear you don't. Write your threshold where you live, laminate them, make them legible, rehearse saying no without a frown and yes without an apology. Distrust authority that lacks receipts and activism that lacks schedules. Measure your engines and your tempers. Keep a resignation letter you don't need. Keep a broom you do, and choose, on screen, one word in plain white over the closing frame of a quiet street at dusk. Choose the kind of boring that lets your city sleep and wait without auditioning for a myth. Are we finished? No. Are we better? Only if we keep the Covenant louder than the car, heavier than the badge, and sturdier than our favorite illusions, and that, inconveniently hopeful as it is enough for a conclusion I can live with and a morning your block deserves.